This week on NES Works, Mappy quits the force so that he can jingle all the way. Well, it took 4 years, but Mappy finally makes his way from Famicom and arcades to the NES. More or less. Now, if you had been dreaming of the original arcade version of Mappy on your NES, oh, sweet summer child from 1989, brace yourself for a world of disappointment. This is not that. Like a lot of Namco's early arcade classics, the original Mappy showed up on Famicom before the NES made its American debut, and then completely failed to make its way overseas. Well, at least as an NES cartridge. Mappy, along with other Mapper Zero NES ROMs, published before the advent of memory management chips like the MMC-1, became a fixture of pirate multi-carts. This meant that kids growing up in countries with no significant official Nintendo presence, which is to say much of the Pacific Rim, Soviet states, Middle East, and Latin America, grew up playing Mappy and its contemporaries on their Dindies and Little Tyrants. Whereas we in the US missed out and had to settle for more advanced games that were harder to pirate and compile. Mappy for NES wouldn't show up here officially until a few decades later, by which time, of course, the NES had been dead for a decade and you couldn't even buy random new old stock in the Toys R Us deep discount bins. No, Mappy became a fixture of plug-and-play mini-consoles. In the early days, Namco and their partners actually went to the trouble of emulating arcade boards, but eventually everyone decided that it would be a lot easier to just shove the NES versions of games together and emulate a single hardware spec instead of trying to hammer out the particulars of multiple distinct boards. So then what the hell is this Mappy game on NES from March 1989, you may ask? Settle down, summer child, it's Mappy-Land, Mappy's first console-exclusive adventure and the only one to reach American retail. It's also our second release from Taxan, the game publisher that will banish Naxatsoft back to its home in the fifth dimension if you can trick them into saying it. Again, none of Namco's Famicom releases showed up on NES, under Namco's name, until 1993 due to their spat with Nintendo, so Taxan jumped in and snatched up this arcade spin-off for home release here. Mappy-Land belongs to a sort of hangover phase of NES releases, the last residual headache of the early pre-MMC days of the Famicom trickling into the West. As new publishers staked out a claim on the NES market, they often dipped into the Famicom's older library for games they felt might have fared well in the US as a way to set up camp before starting to produce new, more current-feeling software. It's kind of like how distilleries sell vodka or gin for a few years until they've managed to mature their first whiskeys enough for release, since those liquors don't need to be aged the way whiskey does. Except in this case, the material freshman publishers were putting out on NES were of a ripe vintage, with an age statement right there on the title screen. Specifically, Mappy-Land hails from 1986. That puts it in the same graduating class with Culture Brain's own vintage release from early 1989, Kung Fu Heroes. Although I gotta say, Mappy-Land plays a lot better than Kung Fu Heroes. At this point, I do feel the need to confirm that Kung Fu Heroes is indeed my new go-to punching bag until something more contemptible comes along, which no doubt comes as a great relief to my chronics who previously enjoyed that honor thanks to 1942 and Athena. Originally published and commissioned by Namco, Mappy-Land owes its existence to Tosei. I don't know how much of the game's design Namco dictated and how much was left to Tosei to come up with on their own, but the mix works pretty well. Whoever headed up this project clearly said, "We are going to create a game that transplants Mappy's gameplay into something with a Super Mario Bros. Structure." Because it was 1986 and everyone was scrambling over themselves to quaff a bit of that sweet, sweet Super Mario juice. Tosei did a much better job of taking lessons from Nintendo's mega hit than Culture Brain did. I mean, yes, you have 8 worlds and 4 levels, kind of, but there's an attempt here to connect with the fundamental appeal of Super Mario instead of just ripping off its sound effects. And this approach probably came off a lot better in 1986 when Mappy first launched in the wake of Super Mario Bros., which was still fresh and thrilling, as opposed to in early 1989 when American kids were still engrossed by the sequel to Mario, or at least the game wearing Mario drag, but still not bad. You would never mistake Mappy-Land for anything but a Mappy title. Although it does give our protagonist the ability to jump on his own steam, getting about this game's world involves relying on trampolines to propel our little guy high in the air. Every stage consists of multi-level structures, though the later levels do mix this up a bit, broken up by gaps containing trampolines. When you fall onto a trampoline, it will propel you directly into the air. and you can duck onto an adjacent platform by tapping left or right at the height of your choosing. In addition to allowing you to navigate the world, the trampolines offer a second advantage. As long as you're leaping on one of them, the bad guys can't hurt you. The evil fat cat Goro and his Meowky rabble continue to chase Mappy in pursuit of a tasty meal, but for whatever reason, they can't seem to grab Mappy while in midair. The stages in Mappy-Land have a more modern form than those in the original game. Rather than consisting of a single enclosed space that you can only complete by collecting items, these levels require you to collect items and scroll all the way to the goal at the right side of the level. The levels also offer a lot more visual variety than the single museum of the arcade original. Mappy undertakes quite a journey here. He makes his way from a train yard in the Old West, through a rainforest, into a haunted graveyard, and eventually to a European castle. That's quite the effort for the little guy, especially considering that he draws his motivation here not from his work obligations as a tiny cop, but rather from his determination to be a good dad regardless. Yes, Mappy has taken Guile's advice to go home and be a family man. Rather than fascistically frying kittens with the museum's inexplicable microwave beams to protect artwork that was probably pillaged from some other culture in the first place, Mappy just wants to bring up his children in a happy home. To that end, Mappy now sets out to collect a bunch of gifts for his family. It seems the little guy blew through his police pension and can't actually afford to buy gifts. So instead he travels around the world on foot to gather up whatever freebies he can find. And then he does it 3 more times. This raises a lot of questions, but those are the rules. You have to complete all 8 stages 4 times, gathering up different tokens each time in order to reach the final bonus round and convince your children that you really do love them. If we're being honest, this is probably Mappy-Land's greatest weakness. It's a pretty shoddy way to recreate the 8-world 4-stage dynamic of Super Mario Bros. What I'm saying is that this is no Adventure Island. In fairness, Mappy-Land leans deliberately enough into pre-Super Mario Bros. Design elements that I don't think it's meant to be some sort of reinvention of the medium, more like Mappy meets the best of Nintendo. This becomes explicit once you reach the jungle stage, which you need to navigate by traversing a combination of vines and moving springing platforms. This absolutely screams Donkey Kong Jr. and leaves you with the impression that Tosei chose to work with the classics, remixing Mappy into the sort of game that could have been released as a Nintendo Black Box or Pulse Line title. And in that respect, it works pretty well. Even more impressively, it doesn't simply lean on Mappy's arcade play mechanics, but nevertheless captures the spirit of the thing. You can't stun your feline pursuers by smashing doors into them or blasting them with radioactive microwave beams anymore, but you still need to take your enemies out of action to give yourself some breathing room. Mappy-Land gives you new options here, distracting rather than harming the cats. Cat toys allow you to take Mewkies out of the action by causing them to attempt to play with the object you've dropped, whereas to divert greedy Goro's attention, you need to toss Koban coins. It's a creative choice that's loaded with personality, and at the same time feels less violent than the coin-op, making it better suited for a game aimed at kids. Which is not to say that Mappy-Land entirely eschews violence. You can take pursuers out of the action by deploying hazards that appear around each stage, such as bombs and what appear to be speed bags. You can even go full anti-velociraptor on baddies by grabbing onto an overhead parallel bar and turning Mappy's own body into a spinning whirlwind of death. In the haunted house stage, Mappy can go full New Zealand adventure by floating around on a balloon and zapping the Mewki's ghosts with a beam gun. That stage mixes up the action a fair bit, requiring you not to hunt for gifts, but rather for a crucifix that will allow you to slip past Goro, who is now a vampire. In order to do that, you need to duck inside a cathedral, which you unlock by collecting keys in the outdoor space. This is one of those late-game gameplay swerves that hints at a more ambitious game that might have been. Mappy-Land is a solid and entertaining game, but once you clear the haunted house, you can't shake the impression that the developers barely scratched the surface of the format's potential. Still, lest you doubt this game ultimately belongs to the Namco arcade tradition, Mappy-Land contains plenty of obscure hidden bonuses that you can only find by luck or by social sharing. Shades of Druaga, but in a reasonable way. For example, the haunted house stage isn't the only level with interior spaces you can venture into in pursuit of goodies. These interiors overtly reference the original Mappy, all the way down to its music, to help reinforce the lineage behind this adventure. A bit of a balm for those who regret the fact that the NES never received Namco's real, honest-to-God arcade port. As a 1989 release, Mappy-Land feels slight and simple, but not indefensibly so. And it demonstrates the Jekyll and Hyde personality of Tosei. Mappy-Land is a creation of the good Jekyll Tosei. That is to say, Tosei when working with what was probably a reasonable budget and deadline. That's different from the Hyde Tosei we know from their Bandai collaborations, where they almost definitely had to churn out games about media properties in a couple of weeks in exchange for a salary of stale pizza crusts. Speaking of Bandai, here's a game that forces me to eat my words. Dance Aerobics turns out to be not only pretty good, but also kind of innovative? What the hell, Bandai? This is not your way at all. Of course, you'd barely know that this game has anything to do with Bandai and its NES incarnation. Being another release for the PowerPad Exercise Mat peripheral, Dance Aerobics wears first-party Nintendo branding here in the US. That includes the box, which stands out from packaging found across the NES library thanks to its emphasis on photography of real people. It's this and anticipation, and that's no mistake. Nintendo was already laying the groundwork for their Wii and DS era marketing here, aiming for mass market appeal rather than focusing on the usual game enthusiasts. I suspect that the emphasis on aerobics has limited the game's popularity among NES collectors. Well, that and its connection to a cumbersome and not especially useful peripheral. But at the time, I can see why Nintendo and Bandai went this direction. Tying the game to the 80s aerobics craze made it feel very much a product of its time, an interactive companion to the fitness and workout videotapes that had begun to creep into the market. In fact, Richard Simmons' Sweatin to the Oldies had just debuted in 1988, definitively marking the exercise tape era. Dance Aerobics actually predates that release in its aerobic studio form for Famicom, but my point here is that Dance Aerobics was an incredibly timely release for NES. Nintendo sitting absolutely on trend. Or rather, not sitting. The company had been struggling to court the general consumer market since the beginning. From its early NES marketing that treated the console as a side piece to the Robot Operating Buddy toy, to its fizzled attempt at bringing Super Mario Sweater to the US, where it would have taught American kids to sew Nintendo-themed outerwear. With Dance Aerobics, the company finally had a compelling offering for the casual market. By which, and let's be honest, we mean women. The 80s aerobics trend was heavily pushed toward women, kind of like Zumba today. I mean, sure, men could and did participate in aerobics, but the marketing and presentation of fitness tapes in particular was heavily aimed at housebound housewives, but didn't have the time or allowances to pursue fitness outside the home. The aerobics boom was a last gasp of the rigid gender dynamics that had begun to crumble in the 1960s, but which still held America in a fairly firm grip into the 90s. You know, the dynamic where the men go to work each day while the women stay at home to make up the house and take care of the kids. Unless there be any doubt about the intent behind aerobics marketing, you can see it here on the box art. Men and kids wear lumpy, loose clothing, but the adult women slip themselves into form-fitting workout wear. Yes, somehow the 80s managed to turn the male gaze into an entire lifestyle. That seems like a fair amount of baggage to bear for a game that is not only fairly innocuous, but actually deserves props for helping to pioneer the entire rhythm genre. Bandai and developer Human Entertainment came up with step-based music mimicry a full decade before Konami hatched the Dance Dance Revolution series, and a full 20 years before Wii Fit. And to be fair, Dance Aerobics isn't a patch on DDR, but come on, what do you want from an NES game? Dance Aerobics lacks the energetic presentation and compelling soundtrack selection of DDR, but fundamentally it wants you to do more or less the same thing. You play by using the 12-button reverse side of the power pad, placing your feet on the 2 center circles and stepping in one of 5 directions with each foot to match on-screen commands synced to a musical beat. It's a pretty creative concept, like a real-time take on Simon, with probably the most effective voice sampling we've yet heard on NES. Your on-screen instructor chirps encouragement and calls out commands as you play, a sort of pixel-based precursor to Wii Fit's ghostly trainers. Dance Aerobics actually offers players multiple modes of gameplay, each containing differing degrees of interactivity and challenge. In normal mode, you follow on-screen commands to perform routines in time to music, with your efforts scored as you go. The game penalizes missteps and rewards correct actions, with a routine screeching to a halt if you allow your score to dip to 0. Aerobics mode works much like normal mode, minus the score penalty. Even if you totally whiff your actions, the routine continues to completion. And finally, Pad Antics mode breaks from the basic call-and-response gameplay in favor of alternate minigames. Ditto, for example, plays like Twister, asking you to place specific limbs on specific power pad buttons. Matt Melodies works almost exactly like Simon, playing increasingly elaborate strings of commands accompanied by musical notes that players need to recall and repeat. And tune-up is the least game-like feature in the entire cartridge, turning the power pad into a simple synthesizer and allowing you to improvise your own tunes. All in all, it's a pretty inventive release and resembles nothing else on NES. For that matter, nothing available for any other console at the time quite worked like Dance Aerobics either. I think its reach and legacy have been severely limited by its marketing and the fact that it relies on a peripheral that doesn't really come across via emulation. I mean, the power pad certainly isn't perfect, and it can be especially tough to stay centered on the 12-button side of the mat thanks to its lack of actual raised physical features. But Dance Aerobics like DDR and Wii Fit is really only interesting when you have to move your weak, gamer ass to keep up with the commands. As games that debuted a decade before their time go, you could certainly do worse. As for what Nintendo Power said, well, not much in terms of Mappy-Land. They got a single pack watch mention in issue 5, which seems just about right. Dance Aerobics also got a pack watch mention in issue 3, but it would truly shine as part of the Power Pad Playoffs feature in issue 5. I mean, it's ultimately just a bit of marketing fluff, but still, it does a decent job of conveying what the card actually contains. Next time on NES Works, nothing says girl power like a lady who can transform into a heavily armored spaceship.